Hello there, welcome to this video, and I'm very pleased to have Steve Rosen with us. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing great, Andy. Wonderful to be here, buddy.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you. You've messaged me a couple of times telling me that you've got all sorts of different stories and information from your illustrious career. So could you tell the viewers what your illustrious career has been?
What my illustrious career has been, in a nutshell, I was writing since about 1972. I've written for probably hundreds of music publications, in the U.S. and in Europe and in Asia. I've written 8 books, including my most recent book. The first edition came out in 2021, titled Tonechaser, about my remarkable 26-year friendship with Edward Van Halen. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed just about everybody of note on the planet. The one that's gotten away, and I'm still going after him, is Eric Clapton. I've never interviewed Eric, but I've interviewed Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and all of his good buddies, yeah, it's been a remarkable career. Becoming a freelancer sort of in the early mid 1970s, all these music magazines were just being born, and they needed freelance writers, So, if you had the goods and you could kind of knock on the door and get in the door, they kind of embraced you. And so I was lucky enough to be there and writing for all these amazing publications over the years. And it's been pretty remarkable, pretty amazing run.
It has. I mean, I've been at you. You looked at just a list of the drummers that you've interviewed. It was incredible. Just kept going on and on. I would love to focus on this new book that you have written, which, of course, covers Eddie Van Halen, who, of course, is one of the great geniuses of rock music, also one of the most charismatic musicians to come out of the whole rock thing, almost like saved heavier rock in the States at the end of the 70s when it was turning into disco, and sold millions of records. And so I've always felt Eddie's like there's no one really to compare to him. And then dying relatively young, he has become quite legendary very quickly. So I would love to pick your brains, but before we do pick your brains, could you just remind the audience again of what the book's titled, where they can get it? Of course, there's a link down below for them to jump and grab a copy. So
absolutely. So, I'm sorry, Andy. So the very long title of my book, which is a very long book as well, it's 580 pages. It's called Tonechaser: Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. You can find the book on my website, which is very simple, tonechaserbook.com. And if you guys are Amazon users over there, you can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on eBay. And if you're out there looking for a new snare drum, and while you're sniffing around for a new snare on Reverb, you can go and find a Tonechaser on Reverb as well. So yeah, it's out there, and yeah, it's available. So go check it out, guys.
So let's delve in and find out what is in store in your book. So when you say 26-year friendship, when would that have been when you first met him?
I met Edward Van Halen in July 1977.
So this is way longer, really, isn't it? What you're saying is that's the first time you met him. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's. I mean, yeah. And it's funny because I had to scramble my brain when I first started writing. I said to myself, it was important to me. I need to pinpoint, if not the exact day, at least the month, and if not the month, the year when I met Edward. I just felt that was, if I got that wrong, or if I hedged about that, it's like everything else after that felt somehow not real. So it took me a while to really kind of figure that out. And I only figured that out sort of reverse engineering in one of the later interviews I did with him. Somehow I mentioned to him, I go, Edward, can you believe we've known each other for this long? I met you that first night when Cheap Trick was playing at the Whiskey. And I thought, oh my God, there's a clue. So I went back and I knew it was somewhere around 77. It could have been 78. Um, and I found the date, July. I can't remember in my head. It was like July 6th or 7th, 1977. Cheap Trick was recording a live record at the Whiskey, which is sort of a smallish club in Hollywood, 200-seater. The next year they would record live at Budokan and blow up, but in 77 they were still, they were still playing clubs at the Whiskey. So yes, July 77 is about 8 months before that first Van Halen record comes out in February 78, right? So I met him when he was sort of this kid in this band who had, done well, and everybody was talking about him. Oh, you got to hear this Edward Van Halen, he's a guitar player. He's great, and his band got a deal on Warner Brothers, in 77, that night when I met him, he was just sort of this quiet guy, and I met him upstairs in a dressing room at the Whiskey, and he was standing in a corner smoking what would be his ubiquitous cigarette, and he was just a really kind of humble guy. Yeah, man, we got a deal on Warner's, and I think we made a good record, and I hope it does okay. And that's really who he was. It wasn't this false modesty, which you can typically see through a lot in somebody, but he really felt that way, and that's the person that I knew for many, many years. July 77 is the first time I meet Edward Van Halen.
And did you meet the other guys in the band as well, or was it just Eddie?
I would eventually meet Michael, David, and Edward's brother Alex. That's a good question, actually. I'm trying to think when I would have first met them. I think the first time I may have met Alex, Alex didn't live far from where Edward was living. So when I first met Edward in 77, he was still living at home with his parents in a town called Pasadena, California, which is where they grew up, and he didn't actually move out of his parents' house, he and Alex, until I believe the second record had come out. So they were still living at home. But once Edward moved out, Alex moved out as well, and they lived pretty close to each other. So I probably would have met Alex, who was over at Edward's a lot, just hanging out, and they would play together. Alex would be playing drums and Edward would be playing guitar. So I probably met him up at Edward's house. Michael, probably backstage at a concert somewhere. They also used to do these huge pre-production rehearsals. I mean, they would set up at these, monstrous sound stages where they would, these sound stages were huge, to run through, pretty much, full lighting and sound.
Yeah.
I mean, these are amazing. So I probably would have run into Michael and Dave there. And then over the years, I would run into them again. I got to know Michael pretty well. No one near as well as I knew Edward. I got to know Alex pretty well. And in fact, I write in the book, we actually go on a double date. He and his then girlfriend and me and my girlfriend at the time, and that's a pretty insane story. Dave, I didn't know that well. Again, I would see him once in a while. I interviewed Dave one time. He was always cordial. I think he realized I was sort of Edward's friend and sort of, gave me a pass, as it were. But honestly, he was very nice. He was very cordial. So over the years, I would have met all of them, and got to know some of the crew pretty well, Edward's techs and those kinds of people. So yeah.
And so when did you go from meeting him through the business to becoming a friend of his? And how did that come about?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I could ask the same of you, Andy. So you meet somebody in school, and where is that line where you just sort of, I like hanging with this guy, or he's cool, to, oh, he's my friend. You know what I mean? It's an invisible line, right? It's the drops of water in the glass, and it overflows. You don't see it overflowing. But I know what you're asking. I really, when I think about it, I think that some of the seeds, and trying not to romanticize it, but I think those seeds were really planted that first night I met him in '77. So we're talking, and we're talking about Eric Clapton, who was one of my favorites, who turned out to be Edwards, probably his biggest influence, and Jeff Beck. And we're talking about music and Purple and stuff. And then he runs out of the room and he comes back and he's got a pen. And he picks a piece of paper up off the floor and he's writing something down. He hands it to me and it's his phone number. He says, "Hey, man, I really enjoyed talking to you. Call me." Well, I never did call him because I couldn't bring myself to do it. But it wasn't long after I actually did my first phone interview with him several months later. Then I ran into him the second time. They were playing Day on the Green. That was a series of shows that the promoter Bill Graham was putting on, where he'd bring together like 4 or 5 bands. And on this day, this is about a year later. This is July 88. Sorry, July 78. AC/DC is opening, because in '78, AC/DC, I think they had just released their first record. Nobody really knew who they were. Then it was Van Halen, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Foreigner. So I meet Edward for the second time at the show, and we kind of say hi, though I think he doesn't really remember me, which is odd because that would happen a lot. Not that he would forget who I was, but he would forget things that we had done. And I know I'm sort of zigzagging here. I introduced him at various periods in time. I introduced him to Ritchie Blackmore, Billy Gibbons, and Les Paul, and he never remembered any of those moments. The next day, he didn't remember that. Anyway, in answer to your question, it probably took a few months, and because where I was living in the Hollywood Hills, I lived in Laurel Canyon, which was sort of the bohemian, funky part of the Hollywood Hills. And Edward was living in the house with Valerie in Coldwater Canyon, which was the expensive part, but we were connected by a street called Mulholland. So we were literally about 8 minutes apart. So I would actually go over there, or he would just pop over to the house, or he would call. So probably after a few months, I think he felt pretty comfortable. And I felt comfortable with him, to the point where I could call him, and he would just, he would come over and just want to hang out. It was pretty amazing,
So that's fascinating that he met people like Ritchie Blackmore, Billy Gibbons, and Les Paul. And really, Eddie he carries on in the same tradition as Les Paul. If there's anybody that's an antecedent to him, it's Les Paul. And you say he couldn't remember. What's your take? And I know it's only your opinion. Why do you think he couldn't remember? Substances, or sort of Away with the Fairies, because a very creative person, or mixture of all of those? What would it be?
It took me 580 pages in the book to figure out, why does he not remember these things, I can only ascribe it to, I really believe that his head was too filled with music and what's the next guitar lick, and those moments just didn't register on his radar. Not that he was being selfish or consciously, it was never that, because if I felt that, it'd be like, well, all right, man, I won't introduce you to, Ritchie Blackmore next time. You know what I mean? It was nothing like that. But it just happened so many times. That's what I think it was. That's what caused it. I would call him, on Monday. He'd say, "Call me tomorrow at 10 a.m. I call him tomorrow and I go, "Hi, Edward." He goes, "Well, man, what are you doing?" I go, "We told me to call you." He never remembered asking me to call him. He said, "Oh, I'll call you tomorrow at 2 o'clock." So I'm waiting by the phone at 1 o'clock, at 3 o'clock, and he never calls. But I again, it was never, I never took it personally. Look, it was a little upsetting. My God, Edward, I know that you were a monster Blackmore fan, even though Ritchie treated him pretty badly, and I write about that in the book, and that's an amazing night. But you don't remember that? And what you so rightly pointed out, Andy, yes, Les Paul and Edward Van Halen, when you think about artists who were not only remarkable musicians, but inventors. I mean, we know about Les Paul and multi-tracking and, you know, creating the Les Paul and all of that, you know. Yeah, I mean, those two, and I was able to get those two together on a night when Edward and Les were being inducted into the Guitar Center Rock Walk, where they put their hand famously, give me Andy, you know, in cement out in front of the store, you know. And the next day, I'm talking to Edward, and I was going, Ed, hey man, listen, you know, I know that you know you have a lot going on, but if you could kind of let me know what's going on, that would be great. In '86, I approached Edward about writing his authorized biography. He said yes. We signed simple contracts. So my reference here is that he would go off and do these things, and he would never let me know. As someone who was trying to write his life story, it would have been nice to know, and maybe I could tag along, you know. So I asked him about that, and I go, Edward, it would have been great, you know, if you'd let me know. He goes, well, man, I didn't know I was going to be there at Guitar Center until the last minute. I go, well, yeah, I know. He goes, you were there? And I go, Edward, we sat in the same room. I introduced you to Les Paul. He goes, oh, so you were there. I mean, it was extraordinary to me, you know. But yeah, man, his just head was filled with music, and the next riff.
I understand that, and I think with Edward Van Halen, you're dealing with a level of genius which is unlike your standard sort of rock legend genius. Because I can understand that he must have loved Ritchie Blackmore and Clapton, but he rethinks the guitar from the bottom up, and he's right in there, you know. Think about the pickups, the tremolo arm, the frets, everything he's thinking and rethinking. And for someone to be like that, they have to be so driven that he just must have been focused on things and would not let them go for days, weeks, months on end. And when you're like that, the idea that you're going to let a little bit of your attention go to focus on what you were doing with Les Paul. He probably was more like Les Paul said, you can do this with a Allen key and the bridge. You know, I imagine that's the sort of thing you're describing, which must have been difficult for the rest of the band as well, because they really were massive, weren't they? So you've got this huge band that's actually got a little bit of a creative genius at the center of it. Did you feel that, because I, from my distance, I felt like the record company were continually pushing them one way, which was to do cover versions, have the big hit record. And Eddie always wanted to try and reinvent the sound, which the companies don't like. Is that the case? That there was pressure there?
Yeah, man. All those points you bring up, Andy, are really salient. You know, look, you're right. I mean, I was in Edward's hotel room one night. I'd flown out to Chicago. And anyway, it was a huge sold out gig. And then afterwards, we go back to his hotel room. And what does he do? He's got a guitar in his room and he was playing. And I saw him. And if I thought about it, if I had a cassette player going, I know that riff ended up in a song somewhere. Because he wouldn't just go off and noodle on some riff. You know, he wouldn't practice guitar in that aspect. It was always working on something that was going to turn into something. But I mean, I sat there. I mean, I watched him for at least an hour go over and over this riff, you know, and refining it and phrasing it a little bit differently and picking, you know. But yes, that's all he ever did. And honestly, he loved Valerie. And I know I'm winding a little bit here, but he loved Valerie and that marriage. But I really believe that everything was secondary to the music. You know, look, he loved her and he would have done anything for her. But man, when he was in that mode, and yes, the other band members, as much as they gave, Edward felt it was never enough. And that caused a lot of friction between he and Michael and he and Dave. And I need more from you guys. Look, no one was going to be able to give as much as Edward did, who was there 24 hours a day. I mean, literally, you know, I mean, let's be honest, doing drugs. And I did drugs with him, and I got to be honest, and I write about it. And it was fun, you know, but he'd be doing drugs and he'd be up till 6 a.m. writing. Maybe he went to the house for a couple hours to sleep and then he'd go back outside and work some more. But yes, the label early on didn't think that they were going to be successful at all. There was no support from them. And within that first year, right, that tour when they were opening for Montrose and Journey, by the end of that tour, they were blowing those guys off, right? And then they go out and they open for Black Sabbath and they blow Black Sabbath off. But yeah, certainly Warner Brothers wanted more covers, you know. And Edward said, you know, hey man, I'd rather fail with my own music than you know cover somebody else's, you know. And then it got to the point of Diver Down when there were several covers on the record, which really made Edward unhappy. Yeah, it was. And again, you brought up early on, Andy, about, you know, so that first record comes out in '78. So that's at the height of, you know, disco, and maybe punk has dissipated a little bit, man, but it's still all those bands, right? And all the
new wave bands at that point.
Exactly. So yeah, man, he was. Look, I've met a lot of brilliant guitar players. A lot of brilliant guitar players who were around at the time. You know, I mean, George Lynch and Reb Beach and I mean, extraordinary guitar players, and they were all amazing. You know, but Edward, and you hit it on it earlier, also, Andy. That charisma, man, that thing inside him he had that reached out and touched people. There are just so few. You know, people in this world like that. You know, the Eric Claptons and maybe the Jimmy Pages. I mean, there just aren't many of them. And he was
the thing about Eddie and the whole band to a certain extent, but Eddie never pouted. He never tried to be cool. When he's on stage, it looks like he's in his happiest place, and you see that great grin he had. He's always smiling. The thing that really personifies Eddie, and it took me a while to realize this, is that when you step back and look at the band and you go, well, what's their most famous track? What's the track everybody knows? And of course, it's Jump. And Jump is a keyboard riff. The greatest rock guitarist of all time is probably most famous for a riff he wrote on keyboards, which I think points to his genius. And imagine going, this is going to be the single. What this is, yeah, but you're playing keyboards, Eddie. You're Eddie Van Halen. You can imagine. And they go, no, stick with me. And bang, it just changes the world. So a real, you know, real one of a kind. There's a couple of things I'd love to ask you about. Could you add anything to the solo he did with Michael Jackson? Because I think that elevated him up from being a great rock guitar player in the rock guitar world to suddenly being not only a part of Michael Jackson's world, but opening up Michael Jackson to a much bigger audience in terms of MTV with that incredible guitar solo, which is absolutely bonkers. It doesn't obey the rules of pop guitar solos whatsoever. So can you give us any information about that?
Absolutely. I just wanted to touch on Jump real quickly, Andy. Dave Lee Roth said, you cannot play keyboards. You're Edward Van Halen. I mean, he literally said that to him. The band didn't want to do it, you know, and Edward said, we're fucking doing it, you know. You know, so yes, and the fact that, yes, he was a guitar player willing to do that. Because, I mean, look, everything else being equal, look, it wasn't going to be like, oh my God, Edward Van Halen can't play guitar anymore. It was like, it was okay. It was like, you know, oh, Edward can play keyboards, you know, at its worst. But as you mentioned, he never thought that way, which has made him so unique. So the Beat It solo, and I write about this in the book, and it's pretty amazing. Edward's home, and the phone rings, and hi, is Edward Van Halen there? You know, I'm sure Edward somehow, you know, some people would get his phone number, and there'd be prank calls, you know. I don't think Edward recognized the voice. I don't even think he even said anything. So we hung up, you know. And he calls again, and somebody, he says, "Hi, you know, is Edward there?" And I think the voice says, "Hi, Edward. This is Quincy Jones." And Edward doesn't believe it. I think Valerie picks it up, and I think Quincy convinces Valerie that this is Quincy Jones, and Edward takes the phone call. You know, it's funny. I never spoke to Edward about this. I wish I had. I would venture to say that Edward probably wasn't a huge Michael Jackson fan. I doubt whether he had any Michael Jackson records in his collection. You know, did he know who Michael Jackson was? I mean, how could you not know who Michael Jackson was? Did he know who Quincy Jackson was? Quincy Jones was? Certainly. You know, and Quincy said, hey man, I'd like you to come down to solo, do a solo. Ed was, yeah, why not? You know, Alex was away. I don't think Alex was in town. So Edward goes down and he plays on the track, which also famously has Steve Lukather, who is Edward's friend, playing those amazing rhythm guitar parts on there. I think Luke also played bass. I'm not sure about that. And Edward hears it, and basically the solo was just, the song's in E. The solo was just going to be over an E chord. And Edward suggested, now he's in there, you know, Quincy's there, and in the moment, Edward says, hey man, no, can we do this? And it was Edward's suggestion to do the solo over the verse changes, which is like E, D, and C, I think, which is, right, infinitely more interesting for any guitar player, right? There's more harmonic content to work from, you know? And I mean, Quincy's not stupid. He's going to take his input, you know? And literally, I think there was one punch that was done, and yet the solo was amazing. I have to say this. Edward didn't do a lot of that. He didn't guest on a lot of records. And I never thought that his performances on some of these other records they weren't amazing. Those are my feelings, you know? Edward did what he did. Edward wasn't a real jam guy either. Later, he became friends with Les Paul. There was a Les Paul special, and Edward jams with Les. And this is on YouTube, and you can see it. And
I've seen it.
This is me. I don't think Edward played great. I mean, look, he could never play badly, but so for him to play that solo, kind of off the cuff, and I think it was a borrowed amp, and Don Landy was there, right? His audio guru, you know, so Don tweaks a couple things and he runs through that. And yeah, it becomes sort of, you know, the template for any would-be, you know, Van Halen wannabe, you know. And Jennifer Batten, when she played Michael Jackson's band, I think that was part of her audition, right? She had to play that solo, you know. But that was pretty amazing. And again, Edward not asking for any money. You know, look, I can understand Edward doing that, but management not saying anything, or the label not saying anything. Alex comes back and he was really irate, and we can see some of those YouTube videos up there. Why would you do that? You know, you know, Michael Jackson should have guested on a Van Halen record. That's what Alex suggested. Well, I suppose he could have, you know, but Alex was irate that he did that. Dave was really unhappy that he did it. For Edward, it was just another day at work, you know, which is what made him so remarkable. Money notwithstanding, I mean that record sold, I don't know, 30 or 40 million. So even if he made a penny a record, you know, you're talking about a fair amount of money. It just didn't register with Edward. But that was a pretty amazing moment. I mean, that solo.
I'd like. There's a couple of things I'm quite interested in there. A couple of comments. One of the first one is Quincy Jones is a jazz guy, and they're bringing a rock guy in, and they've prepared a solo. They want his name in, so they put it into E, which every rock guitar solo. And then he turns up and says, "No, can I have the changes?" Which suggests that Eddie had that sort of a mind, almost like a jazz musician's mind as well, to go, oh yeah, I can play through those changes, which he does very well. He outlines. That's a very interesting thing. Now, you said he had a borrowed amp. Now, I have told this story many a time on the channel, that I believe that, and I don't know where I got this from, that amp was actually borrowed from Allan Holdsworth.
It's entirely possible, because I know I'm trying to think of what kind of amp it was, and I know what kind of it is, but I can't think of it. That's entirely possible.
Because what's very interesting, when you listen, because you hear Eddie's got a certain style, and then when he hooks up with Allan Holdsworth, there he has a respect for that guitarist. You can tell that's, and I think that he first heard him on the UK stuff around about 77. That would have been 78. And
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you listen to what Eddie's doing on Beat It, it's very Allan Holdsworthy, but it's done in Eddie's style. It's very cascading notes. Have you got any stories about Allan Holdsworth? Because I'm an Allan Holdsworth nut. Did you ever meet him, or did you ever see the Eddie Allan? And have you got anything to add about him producing Allan, which didn't go so well, did it?
No, no, not so well. I did have the great honor of meeting Allan a couple times. I did interview him, and he was just, yeah, he was another guy who was just absolutely, consumed with guitar. Um, quiet guy, very self-effacing guy. I saw Edward and Allan jam at the Roxy. I think that was one of the first times that Edward was playing a Kramer. And I think that's when the picture where famously there's a piece of tape across the headstock where it says Kramer. Edward loved Allan Holdsworth. I mean, people say, oh, yeah, well, Edward loved Clapton and Richie and Leslie West. He did, man. But he really did love that prog stuff. He loved UK. I mean, again, as you mentioned, and that's where he first heard Allan. And he talks about it, and I have it in the book somewhere. They were doing one of their tours of Europe, and I don't think he was aware of who Allan was at the time. I mean, this is probably an early tour. It's obviously an early tour.
Just to jump in, the UK Allan Holdsworth is 78. So it would have to be 78. So it's got to be that first year where the first albums come out.
Yeah, right. So I think they did tour for the first time in the UK then. And I think he did know who Allan was. And I think he was telling me, my God, we have to go on after this guy. And the response, to Allan and UK, was a little lukewarm, but he loved Allan. Edward wanted to produce Allan's album. When I heard about that, I thought, my God, that would be amazing. Because Allan, I mean, to be honest, he languished, at least over here. Yes, he was a guitar god with guitar nerds, but outside of that, no one knew who he was, right? No one bought Allan Holdsworth records or those early records he made, And again, the story I heard that Edward was out on tour, and he says, "Hey man, I'm gonna be back soon. Hold on." Allan didn't want to wait, went ahead and made the record with Ted Templeman, who's obviously an amazing producer, but there's just no way he understood Allan the way that Edward would have understood him, And the record wasn't a great record. I mean, Allan played great, but it wasn't a great record. And I think that was a monstrous mistake.
I've gone to the back end of this, and obviously with my channel being so proggy and fusiony, I'm trying to cover a lot of the stuff that other channels wouldn't get into. And I actually think that the Road Games album is great. The thing is, they never got anything done. It's half an album. The tracks they did do are great. It's beautifully recorded for a Holdsworth album. The production values are very high. Drum sounds are great. You've got Jack Bruce on vocals, incredible. But it's just half an album. And that's very interesting. And if Holdsworth had just held on, maybe Eddie would have been able to coax something out of him. But talking to a lot of people about Allan, he did languish in obscurity, but it was almost like he put himself there. And every time somebody offered him a hand to say, look, you just do this one thing, it will set you up. And people really came to his aid, and he pushed it away. I even heard rumors like companies would come along and offer him like a pretend job almost, saying, we'll put you as the sort of resident expert, for whatever guitar company will pick up. And he'd go, no, I'm not doing that. So he would be back out trying to eke a living out of, tiny gigs and stuff. Very, very interesting. What other sort of proggy stuff and fusion-y stuff was Eddie into? Can you remember specific artists he liked?
You know, it's funny, sort of a corollary to what you're asking me, Andy. I used to have a monstrous record collection. I mean, I had a lot of records. Before I started writing, I probably had about 2,000 or 3,000 records. I would go to used record stores. As a rock journalist, you know, one of the, you know, some of the swag they give you are you know, they'll send you the monthly releases. So I was getting all these albums. So I had a huge collection. And I remember Edward was over, you know, and I had like all the records on these, you know, makeshift shelves, you know, the wood with the bricks, you know, that are threatening to fall over every minute. And I remember going through and pulling out stuff I thought that Edward would have been interested in. And I pulled out some of that stuff, stuff that I knew that I thought, well, maybe he doesn't know about this stuff, you know. So I remember pulling out some Gentle Giant records, some Coliseum records, some Nice records, not that they're necessarily prog, but you know, I thought, you know, as guitar players, I remember, you know, pulling out, in fact, Les Paul records. I mean, this is way before he met Les Paul. I don't think he was that familiar. I had a bunch of Les Paul records, like Larry Carlton, you know, doing kind of that fusion-y kind of, you know, instrumental stuff. I thought, you know, maybe he listens to it and gets one little thing, you know. I remember weeks ago by and he didn't mention anything, and I know for a fact I am 99% positive he never listened to one album. And he also never gave me any of my albums back. And I gave him like 75 records. So you owe me some records, buddy. Some of these other bands, I mean, not necessarily prog. I mean, there were some bands that I was surprised he knew about. I mean, Budgie, you know, I mean, obviously not a prog band really, but you know, he knew Budgie. He used to do like Budgie covers, you know. So in some ways he went really deep. In other ways, I don't think he knew that much about the history of rock. It was strange.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
How did once? I mean, he emerges, and then very quickly you get Randy Rhoads, and then you get the Steve Vais and the Malmsteens. How did he react to those? Because I always felt his playing was completely unrelated to those guys. They were all great. They were all very much coming out of a sort of fast-picking Al Di Meola. You could see the lineage of their bits of Richie Blackmore. But if they did anything strange, they'd copied it from Eddie. They took the tapping from Eddie. But I never felt that he sounded like those players. How did you feel that when suddenly you get the emergence of all these like sort of guitarists in his wake? And I imagine the especially Steve Vai, because Steve Vai is then picked up by Dave Lee Roth, isn't he? How did you feel about that?
You know, to my mind, to have, you know, as a journalist, if I read something and I go, oh, that sounds like something I would have written, you know, I'd be like, God, that's unbelievable. Edward, I think, felt just the opposite. He would say, well, why don't they get something of their own? You know, I mean, I don't think he ever liked it. You know, he never dug it. Steve Vai is an interesting case. As you so rightly point out, Andy, you know, Steve showing up in Dave's band, you know, and I never spoke to Dave about this. Look, Dave, I think the way he treated Edward was terrible, and I think the way that thing fell apart, you know, was not very good. But the last thing Dave was stupid. Dave was not a stupid guy, so he was going to go find the best band he possibly could, right? And Steve Vai arguably was, you know, the best guitar player around. Maybe, you know, Edward had a lot of respect for Steve. Yngwie, not so much. And again, we talk about Yngwie because I had interviewed Yngwie. I'll make the story real quick. I had interviewed Yngwie in '86 when he was in Alcatraz. My buddy Jimmy Waldo said, hey man, we've got this guitar player, Yngwie Malmsteen. You got to interview him. I go, he's an amazing guitar player, but he's the biggest asshole you've ever met. Okay. I go interview Yngwie. He's living sort of about 25 minutes from where I'm living in the Hollywood Hills. I go and interview him. And when I show up, he's got a guitar on, an electric guitar, and he was practicing. So I start the conversation. He goes, "No, man, I'm not ready yet, man." I go, "Okay." So I'm sitting there, I'm watching him practice, and it's amazing. I mean, I'm watching this guy, you know, rip through these neoclassical riffs. I'm going, "My God, this is astonishing stuff," you know. I end up sitting there for like 25 minutes in mute silence while he finishes. We start talking, and he's an asshole. He tells me he never heard of Jeff Beck. He doesn't listen to Richie Blackmore, blah, blah, blah. So I had no great love lost for Yngwie Malmsteen. It comes up in conversation with Edward, and Edward said, "Yeah, you know, Dave deserves Yngwie, like getting Yngwie and Dave together. That would be Edward's recipe for, you know, comeuppance, you know." But yeah, you know, you're right. Look, I mean, Steve, in their ways, those two guys you point out really don't. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of tapping, but they really don't sound like Edward. Steve loved Edward, and they would later become friends. Yngwie, whether he admits it or not, you know, was a big Van Halen fan, but Yngwie never really sounded like Edward. But just about everybody else did. You know, in one way or another. Obviously, the tapping thing, and it was just Edward's sound, you know, and now everybody's going after the Brown sound, right? And the one pickup humbucker Strat, you know, right, which is totally redefined.
Well, I don't feel when you watch Eddie play, every aspect of his technique is unlike any other guitar playing. His alternate picking's very strange. This sort of very fast flaily thing that he does, and he's sort of almost like tremolos on one string, almost like a flamenco guitarist. His tapping, no one's ever tapped like him. His tapping is so brutal and fierce and strange, you know. His rhythm guitar playing, he plays all these jazz chords and strange. He's got all this stuff. He never riffs like a Richie Blackmore, Tony Iommi. It's always chordal. It's incredible. I mean, I do think he was a real genius. He's nothing to do with his technique. Loads of guitarists had the sort of same level as technique as Eddie. It's a genius of his brain. I just think he is probably the greatest rock guitarist that's ever lived. Hendrix and him, they're the two, you know. I mean, and he wasn't a big fan of Hendrix, is that right?
That's what he always admitted, which I just found so strange. And he always said that, you know, Jimmy was never in tune live, which he wasn't.
It's true.
Somehow that offended his ears. You know, some bands, I've always, you know, some bands are amazing live, and some bands are amazing in the studio. You know, Stones were, to my mind, incredible in the studio, live.
Right,
you know,
yeah, you totally agree.
Right, you know, Van Halen. Would you consider them a live band or studio band? I would consider them a studio band, but they had their moments live. You know, Zeppelin were, to my mind, always a studio band.
Totally, yeah.
But yeah, Edward, somehow that bothered him, and I'm not sure what it was. You would have thought that he would have been a Hendrix fan, because Jimmy, you know, I mean, Van Halen were a trio with a singer, but Jimmy playing in a trio and sort of playing that rhythm, you know,
the rhythm of the lead together. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And also, I just, as you said, I thought maybe every time he watched Hendrix or listened to him, he thought, we need to invent something to stop the tremolo while I'm going out of tune, because it's almost like what Jimmy needs. It would be great if the guitar would just stay in tune. And so Eddie goes and invents a Floyd Rose along with everything else. That would be a lovely if that was actually the case, you know, because exactly. it would show us, talking to you and me thinking about it for so many years, it would show us into the mind of Eddie, because I think he would probably look at many guitarists going, if he did that, you would be able to do that, rather than, oh, I can't believe it, you know. So maybe Clapton was his first hero, and then once he got past him, he was on his own track. Could you fill out a little bit about you saying that Dave Lee Roth didn't treat Eddie well? Because I always felt that Dave's, as much as Eddie Van Halen is one of the great rock guitarists of all time, Dave Lee Roth is, for me, the top 5 frontmen of all time. He's equal but he's equal in terms of show. He's equal in terms of how he sells the songs. People always say he wasn't a great singer. I think he was a fantastic singer. I don't think they understand the lineage. For me, it's almost like going back to people like Al Jolson and that almost like American vaudeville approach. So he's a full-on entertainment. I love Dave Lee Roth, but I could tell that there was a massive difference between the two. Together, it's electric because you've got the show and you've got musical genius all together. So that has to crack at some point. So can you fill in what happened there and why you think Dave was not maybe as nice as he could have been?
Yeah, and with Edward, everything came down to respect. And Edward, again, I write about it in Tonechaser. Excuse me. Edward talks about Dave's importance in the band, and Dave, you know, the look of the band and the look of the videos, and obviously Dave's lyrics and those melodies. That's all Dave. And Edward was very quick to point that out. But it was in those moments when Dave is off climbing a mountain in South America somewhere, or wherever he would go, you know, on those, you know, jungle hikes of his, when he's supposed to be back in the studio doing pre-production, Edward could never let that go. You know, they were obviously, as you pointed out, one guy's a showman, one guy's a musician. That goes back to the first times they met, you know, back in school. They were absolutely different kinds of people, right? Dave had this huge outsized ego, and Edward, you know, would sit at home in his bedroom practicing guitar all day. They were opposites, and Dave had enough chutzpah to say, hey, you know, Alex and Edward Van Halen, they're the best musicians around. I'm going to play with them. I'm going to be a rock star. And he made it happen. Well, yeah, at a point in time, those two kinds of personalities, really, you're in the same bus, on the same bus, and doing the same things all the time, and you're in one another's company. They were never friends. And Edward wanted more from Dave. He wanted more from Michael. And, you know, the 1984 record comes out. They're arguably as big as they ever were. They're now not only a huge band, but they're an important band, right? 1984 is an important record. And Dave wants to go off and do what? Do a solo record? And Edward was like, sure, man, go do it. Well, I didn't know that Dave really was going to leave the band. And I just think the way that Dave did that was horrible. And Edward would tell me, you know, Dave would say to him, no more solos, man. Meaning no more eruptions or the acoustic song. Sorry, man, I'm spacing out. Cathedral or Thank You. You know, you can't do any more of those. You know, and you can't have your wife on the bus. You know, and to Edward, that's all about disrespect, and Edward never forgave him for that. I ran into Dave. It was at a Talos show. Talos was Billy Sheehan's band when Dave was looking to put the band together. And I ran into Dave, and we somehow were talking about Edward. And I go, you know, Dave, you don't show any respect to Edward. He goes, yeah, man, I respect him. I go, no, man, you don't. Maybe in Dave's head, he did. He did respect him, but I don't think he did.
Well, an interesting thing here is the Vi band, the Eaton and Small band, was not supposed to be a band. That band was to get put together to make a film. And I think Dave Lee Roth at that point was thinking he would be able to make a transition from Van Halen almost to film star level, you know, become, you know, and there's a lot of stuff around those videos where there's this you know, there's, what are they called? The Something Brothers, that he'd have like this fake production company. But Vi said they'd written a script and they were talking to film companies, and that was what the plan was. That band was picked to be in that film, and then it fell through. So they went in and did the songs. And so it could have well been with Dave Lee Roth. He had a trajectory that was so not. He thought, I don't want to do this. I want to be a film star, which I think fits in perhaps with his ego of wanting to end up right in the top echelon beyond a sort of just a rock band. But who knows? What I've there's a dark period, isn't there, for Edward Van Halen after this, isn't it? Once Hagar comes in, and then later on he's ill for a start, and obviously you went through all that, and also, what was it, drugs or drink or both, or was the illness exacerbated? What was actually going on there? Because he seems to go through a terrible dark period. It doesn't really affect his playing that much, or did it? What was happening there?
I noticed a change in Edward probably in the early 90s, really. He was a different person. That thing that we had, it just seemed to disappear. It just went away. And I could never figure out what happened, you know. And I'm the kind of person where I go, what did I do? What did I say? Did I insult him? Did I, insult Valerie? What I done? And I went over my head. I never did or said anything. It just never happened, But you talk about the drugs and the alcohol. It got pretty bad around 95. By 95, Gary Sharon, right? So now they're, Sammy's gone and Gary Sharon. They have a new manager, and he gets really bad. Our relationship keeps disappearing. By 2003, I don't want to give the book away, but it's
yeah. I'm trying to get them. I want people to come and go and get your book.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
But he had changed tremendously. And yes, in 2004, we see those videos of him, and his hair is tied up in the samurai bun, and he's got the jeans with the holes in the knees, and a rope holding up his pants, and the torn sneakers. His teeth are gone. He's bad. I know that around 95, there were enablers in the band. These are my thoughts only. In 2000, he's diagnosed. He's very ill. I think that he was diagnosed earlier, and maybe there were no symptoms there, but I think that in my own mind, I think maybe that's what caused that earlier change that I was recognizing. Having that in your head is like, it's like it would change anybody. And yeah, it was horrible. And you say it didn't affect his playing? I didn't. Look, after 2003, when our relationship ended, I never saw any shows. I listened to the Different Kind of Truth record. It was okay. Some people love the record. It was okay.
I went through them again. The records as a whole lack something, without doubt. There's something gone away. But in terms of the innovation of his guitar playing, he is still doing interesting guitar playing. That's still there. But it makes you wonder whether he achieved what he wanted to achieve. And once that was there, when you've got a brain like that, it eats you up as well. But that's a very interesting take. Yeah, perhaps he's having to deal with that illness. And it's almost like this band that he's put together is also seems to fall apart. There's this never-ending getting back together and apart, and Dave Lee Roth comes back in, and you always feel like, why are you getting Dave back in? It's only going to mess up again. It's like, this is done. We've all played in bands, once it's done, it's done. You walk into the room with someone, and within 5 minutes, you're back where you were. Doesn't matter what you've said to patch up. So, he died relatively young. I love the guy so much, and I love his music so much. He seemed to have got past all that. He seemed to have achieved some sense of peace before he died. He looked a lot better. I mean, where was he at when he died?
Yeah, man. So he dies. Edward's only 67, and this day and age, that's pretty young, right? And the thing about Edward is, as I mentioned at the outset, he smoked horribly. And I knew early on, and I write about this. I actually wrote about it, not in depth, but I used to write I wrote in the book, I go, cigarettes are going to take him in the end. It's not going to be the drugs. It's not going to be alcohol. It's going to be cigarettes, and that's what did it. You know, it's an insidious thing, and even if you stop, you know, it's there and it's in you. And but he was able towards the end there to give up drugs and drinking. He was never able to give up cigarette smoking entirely. He ended up vaping, right? Again, I don't know enough about that to know if vaping is any better, any worse than cigarette smoking, but he can never give that up. But yeah, he was certainly in a better place. But then, you know, I think he told me he started smoking and drinking when he was like 12 or 13 years old. You know, so you're smoking for 50 years. Cigarettes don't forget, right? But it's sad, you know. And you hit on an interesting point, Andy. You said, well, maybe, you know, he'd kind of done, you know, what he wanted to do, and I think about that. And you know, you think about people like Hendrix, who obviously also died way too young. And what would Jimmy have done? You try to postulate, well, my God, can you imagine what he would have done? I think that Edward could have gotten more into sort of an orchestrated type of thing, where he would maybe, you know, keyboards would always be involved, but you know, I mean, he was learning cello, and there's a chapter where my buddy comes over to show Edward how to play cello, and that is an amazing thing, you know. And I think he played a little bit of sax. So I don't know, man. You can imagine him doing more orchestrations, more kind of soundtracky kinds of things, more really compositional, maybe no vocals. Those are my thoughts anyway. But yeah, it was horrible, you know. And sadly, I began the book in August 24th, 2020, and I remember the day because it was my birthday. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna start writing this book today, you know. And 6 weeks after I begin the book, he passes away. So that was terrible. That was like, does that mean I'm supposed to keep writing the book? Does that mean I don't write the book? Are people going to think that I'm, you know, sucking the blood of this person who used to be, you know, I mean, all those thoughts go through my head. But it was horrible. It was sad, you know. I mean, I believe that he had so much more music left in him. And, you know.
I when about 2 or 3 years ago, I'd played in bands, and I got sick of the bands. I got sick of the industry. You know, nobody could sell any records anymore. Blah blah blah. All that's going on. The colleges had changed, and I was 50. I thought, I've had it, and I sunk into a very deep depression at that point. When I then moved on to YouTube, the problem I'm having now is my wife will say this is all I'm doing, because all my life, whatever I do 100%. I don't let go. And so over the last 3 years, I don't think I've ever not put a video out. Every single day I've put a video out. And it's because it keeps my brain from turning back on myself. And so characters like Eddie Van Halen, the genius is incredible, and I love them for it. But I think creative people, they also, you sort of recognize something, and you're a creative person as well. So I'm sure you have that, you know, when you're working on your book and you're ensconced in it, it's like you feel like you get up in the morning with a purpose. Once that's gone, what's life about? What are we here for? What's the point? You know, and you look at what normal people do and think, oh, you know, so I think it's the curse. And so if I'm like that, what's it like being Eddie Van Halen?
That's an interesting point, you know, and you're right. You know, with me, it's like, yes, for me, writing the book was an escape. Some people have used the word closure. I never set out to write the book to look for closure, but maybe that's what it was about, you know, because the relationship ended so unclosed, you know.
Yeah.
I always look back at what I've done and go, oh my God, it could have been so much better, you know. And I don't know if Edward ever felt that way, but yes, I think that if he didn't have a guitar in his hand, And again, literally, and I with no exaggeration, every moment I was with him, he had a guitar in his hand. He'd come over to my place. I had a couple of guitars and stands. He'd pick up a guitar. Every single time I was over to his place, he'd be sitting there in the studio with a guitar, you know. So yeah, those moments maybe when he was sick and maybe not able to write or to, you know, that to think about music, maybe that, you know, that must have been horrible. I mean, yeah, you think about people like that. I mean, it's hard to put yourself in that place.
Well, when my dad got cancer, before we knew he got cancer, about 6 months before, he turned around and he said, I might not be here next year. And I said, what are you on about? And he says, I don't know. And he sort of knew. And the reason was that things he would do in the house, certain jobs, all these things he couldn't do anymore. He wasn't operating. And I wonder, like you said earlier on in the 90s, maybe as when that kicked in as well, it sort of knocked his being off, because I could, like, when I sit down and drum, I can tell if I'm going to get a cold or flu about 2 or 3 days before I do. The drumming, you know, it's fascinating. My phone's about to run out of power. I think this is a really great concise. I'm going to get you back, Steve, because I know there's so much here. But I really do. I'm going to have to get a copy of this book as well. Sounds absolutely fascinating. And I really want you to sell some copies. And I know my lot are going to go and buy it. So the link is down below. I'm going to thank Steve for coming on here and telling us all about Eddie Van Halen. I'm absolutely fascinated by his story. He really is one of a kind. I really think that rock music, if rock music created one musical genius, maybe Frank Zappa, Eddie Van Halen, and Malcolm Young. He's another guy that I think is incredible. What he could make out of virtually nothing, you know. And so, yeah, I go for those three. It's been lovely to talk to you, Steve. I can see my wife texting me about my dinner. That's the trouble. Normal life is now coming back in, and got to go sort the kids out and all that type of stuff. It's been lovely to talk to you.
It's great, Andy. Thanks so much, man. Let's do some more.
Yeah, we'll definitely do some more. You've had a very interesting life, and I think there's even more to cover with Eddie Van Halen, but I want to go away and digest it a little bit. Right, so
cool, man.
I'm going to try and stop this now. Lovely. Oh, hang on.